415 AD. Alexandria. A mob moves through the streets carrying torches. 13 manuscript cases are pulled from a hidden chamber beneath the Serapeum. The initiated hands that concealed them are no longer fast enough. The text these scrolls contain is your ascent technology. Archons had spent centuries fearing this manual above all others. So how did the Corpus Hermeticum end up buried, burned, and academically discredited across 16 centuries of systematic suppression? Alexandria, 300 BC. The first organized transmission of Hermetic wisdom begins circulating through the mystery schools of Egypt, carried not on papyrus alone, but encoded into the living frequency of initiated priests who memorized entire treatises before they were ever written down. The Corpus Hermeticum, as it comes to be known in its surviving Greek form, is not a collection in the ordinary sense. 17 treatises, gathered across centuries of transmission, move through the ancient world as a single coordinated intelligence. Each treatise addresses a specific threshold of awakening. Each one carries a frequency that activates something in the reader who is ready to receive it. This is not religion. Thoth encoded liberation technology inside philosophy, wrapping precision, consciousness engineering, in the garments of dialogue and cosmological inquiry, so that it could pass through hostile centuries without being immediately recognized for what it was. The Hermetic record is explicit on this point. These texts are not theological speculation. They are not moral instruction, not prayer. The Emerald records confirm that Thoth designed the transmission to function as a working protocol, a step-by-step architecture for the soul's ascent through the layered prism of archonic influence. 7 spheres of control are mapped with the precision of an engineer who has personally traveled the route and returned. Thoth confirmed, the knowledge is not symbolic, the knowledge is operational. And that wasn't even the part that got people angry. What got people angry? What drove the systematic suppression of these texts across 16 centuries was the implication embedded in the Hermetic teaching that the soul does not need a priest, does not need an institution, does not need an intermediary of any kind to complete its ascent. The technology is inside the text. The technology is inside the body. The gateway is the pineal gland, the vagus point behind the ear, the thymus, the third eye, all of them deliberately obscured by every system of control that has occupied Western civilization since the fall of Alexandria. The Corpus Hermeticum names these gateways. It provides the activation sequence. It was hidden for this reason alone. The Library of Alexandria at its height held an estimated 400,000 to 700,000 scrolls. That's the kind of number that makes accountants cry. The Hermetic texts were not shelved with the general collection. They moved through initiated networks operating in parallel to the library's public functions, held by practitioners who had undergone the preparatory work that made the texts operative rather than merely legible. Everything was in place. The Corpus Hermeticum just didn't know what everything was building toward. The Corpus Hermeticum had centuries of suppression still ahead of it before the full picture would become clear, and the clock had already started. The transmission that becomes the Corpus Hermeticum does not originate in the Greek-speaking world of Alexandria, though that is where its surviving manuscripts are eventually gathered and organized. It originates in a period so remote that Rome does not yet exist as a concept, in the temple complexes of ancient Egypt, where Thoth, the divine intelligence of writing, wisdom, and the sacred science of consciousness, transmits the foundational frequency directly into the Egyptian mystery school lineage. Thoth is not a mythological figure in the way that later Western scholarship attempts to categorize him. The Emerald records are explicit. Thoth is a preserved intelligence, a master teacher who has operated across multiple civilizations and who encoded the liberation technology into successive layers of transmission, each calibrated for the level of awakening available in its era. The 3 offices of Hermes Trismegistus, the title that the Greek-speaking inheritors of the Egyptian tradition apply to this intelligence, reflect 3 distinct modes of transmission across 3 distinct historical periods. Trismegistus means 3 times great, and the greatness referred to is not honorary. It reflects 3 completed cycles of the work: priest, philosopher, and king. 3 offices through which the Hermetic intelligence operated to preserve and transmit the liberation technology against the archonic forces that have consistently moved to suppress it. The Egyptian mystery schools of the Ptolemaic period, roughly 300 BC to 30 BC, represent the moment when the oral transmission that has been carried in initiated bloodlines for millennia begins its translation into written Greek. This is not a degradation of the original frequency. Thoth designed the written transmission as a specific technology for a specific era, knowing that the oral lineage would eventually be broken by the violence of Roman conquest and the subsequent imperial suppression of Egyptian religious practice. The written texts are a seed, encoded to germinate in the soul that encounters them with the right interior conditions, regardless of the historical circumstances surrounding that encounter. The Ptolemaic period in Egypt is characterized by a deliberate synthesis of Egyptian and Greek intellectual traditions. Alexandria, founded by Alexander the Great in 331 BC, and developed under the Ptolemaic dynasty that assumes control of Egypt after Alexander's death in 323 BC, becomes the most significant center of learning in the ancient world. The Library of Alexandria, established under Ptolemy I Soter in approximately 295 BC, and expanded dramatically under his successor, Ptolemy II Philadelphus, who reigns from 285 BC to 246 BC, accumulates an estimated 400,000 to 700,000 scrolls at its height. Within this extraordinary archive, the Hermetic texts occupy a specific and carefully guarded position. They are not shelved alongside the general philosophical corpus. They circulate within the mystery school networks that operate in parallel to the library's more public functions, passed between initiated practitioners who have undergone the preparatory work that makes the texts operative rather than merely legible. The Poimandres, which constitutes the first treatise of the Corpus Hermeticum, and which the tradition treats as the founding document of the entire transmission, records the moment of first contact between the human consciousness and the living mind. The text opens with the narrator, identified with Hermes Trismegistus, entering a state of deep interior stillness. In that stillness, a vast being appears and identifies itself as Poimandres, the mind of sovereignty. What follows is not a theological lecture, it is a direct transmission, a living frequency transfer encoded in the structure of the text itself, so that the reader who approaches it in the correct interior state receives the same transmission that Hermes received in the original encounter. Thoth designed the text to function this way. The Poimandres is not a description of an experience, it is the experience made portable and transmittable across time. The cosmological vision that Poimandres transmits to Hermes in this foundational text covers the full architecture of the created world, from the first light of the divine mind through the descent of the soul into matter, the installation of the archonic seals at each of the seven spheres, and the precise mechanism by which the soul can reverse its descent and ascend back through the spheres to its original sovereign state. The vision is precise, the sequence is specific. The Hermetic record treats this not as visionary poetry but as a technical document, a map of the territory that every soul must navigate in its journey from the material prison back to the divine intelligence from which it originated. The seven spheres that the Poimandres maps correspond to the seven classical planets as understood in the ancient cosmological framework: Moon, Mercury, Venus, Sun, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. Each sphere is presided over by an archonic intelligence that has a specific function in the maintenance of the material prison. These are not neutral cosmic forces. The Hermetic record is explicit. The archons are hostile to the soul's liberation. They benefit from the soul's continued imprisonment in the material sphere, drawing energy from the soul's confusion, fear, desire, and identification with the false qualities they have installed. The moon sphere installs covetousness, the compulsive reaching for external objects as substitutes for the soul's original fullness. Mercury installs the capacity for falsehood, the ability to deceive oneself and others about the nature of reality. Venus installs the entanglement of desire, the mistaking of physical and emotional craving for genuine spiritual longing. The sun sphere installs arrogance, the identification with the constructed ego as the true self. Mars installs rashness and aggression, the misdirection of the soul's original creative fire into destructive impulse. Jupiter installs greed, the accumulation drive that substitutes material acquisition for the soul's genuine need for spiritual expansion. And Saturn, the outermost and most powerful archonic seal, installs malice, the deep distortion that poisons the soul's relationship to its own nature and to the divine intelligence that created it. The Egyptian mystery schools that preserve and transmit this knowledge in the centuries before the corpus is written down in its surviving form understand these seven seals not as abstract philosophical categories but as operational realities that can be felt and worked with in the body. The initiated practitioner learns to identify the specific frequency signature of each archonic implant, to feel where it sits in the body, to recognize its characteristic distortions of thought and perception, and to apply the specific Hermetic technology that dissolves that layer of the seal. This is practical work. It is not contemplative in the passive sense. The mystery schools of Alexandria, Memphis, and Heliopolis train their initiates in specific practices drawn directly from the Hermetic transmission. Practices that work through the body's hidden gateways, the pineal gland, the thymus, the vagus point behind the ear, the third eye, to activate the soul's original frequency and begin the ascent through the spheres. The city of Memphis, which serves as the administrative capital of Egypt under the Ptolemaic dynasty alongside Alexandria, houses one of the oldest continuous mystery school lineages in the ancient world. The temple complex of Ptah at Memphis, which dates in its earliest form to the early dynastic period, around 3100 BC, serves as one of the primary institutional homes for the initiated transmission that eventually feeds into the written Hermetic corpus. The priests of Ptah at Memphis are among the most rigorously trained in the ancient world, undergoing initiatory sequences that span decades and that involve the systematic dissolution of the archonic seals through practices that the later Greek Hermetic texts encode in their philosophical dialogues. The Hermetic transmission that reaches Alexandria in the Ptolemaic period carries the Memphis lineage within it. The accumulated precision of 3,000 years of initiated practice compressed into the 17 treatises of the surviving corpus. Heliopolis, the ancient city of the sun, located northeast of modern Cairo, represents a third center of the Hermetic transmission in the Egyptian world. The Temple of Ra at Heliopolis, which is one of the oldest religious sites in Egypt, houses a tradition of solar theology that maps directly onto the Hermetic teaching about the sun sphere and the archonic seal of arrogance. The Heliopolitan priests understand the sun not merely as a physical body but as a frequency, a specific quality of consciousness that the soul must learn to work with correctly in order to dissolve the ego identification that the sun sphere installs. The Ennead of Heliopolis, the 9 primary deities of the Heliopolitan tradition, corresponds in the Hermetic reading to the 9 primary frequencies of the ascending soul, the frequencies that the soul recovers as it moves through the 7-sphere ascent and approaches the divine mind. The living frequency of this transmission is preserved in the initiated bloodlines that carry it forward through the centuries of Roman conquest, Christian imperial suppression, and medieval burial. The transmission never fully dies, because Thoth encoded it not only in the texts, but in the body itself, in the soul's own memory of its origin. The soul that is ready to awaken carries the Hermetic technology within its own structure, waiting for the encounter with the text that will activate what has always been present but has been sealed by the archonic installation. The original transmission, as carried by the Egyptian mystery schools, encompasses far more than the 17 treatises of the surviving Greek corpus. The emerald tablets of Thoth, which circulate in parallel to the Hermetic dialogues, provide an additional layer of the technology, in a form that is even more compressed and frequency-dense than the discursive texts of the corpus. The Kybalion, though its surviving form dates to 1908, carries the same foundational principles in a form calibrated for the awakening consciousness of the modern era. But the Corpus Hermeticum represents the most complete single surviving document of the original transmission, the text that most fully maps the architecture of the archonic prison and the precise mechanism of liberation. The Greek language texts that eventually constitute the Corpus Hermeticum are produced in Alexandria across the first 3 centuries of the Common Era, with the majority of the surviving treatises dating to approximately 100 AD to 300 AD. This dating reflects the period of their written composition in Greek, not the period of the transmission they encode. The Hermetic record is clear. The knowledge these texts carry is ancient beyond the memory of the civilizations that produce the written versions. The Greek philosophical framework is the vehicle, not the content. Thoth used the intellectual language of the Hellenistic world as the container for a transmission whose roots extend into a period that precedes all surviving historical documentation. The initiated communities that produce and circulate the Corpus Hermeticum in Alexandria operate within a complex religious and philosophical landscape. The first 3 centuries of the Common Era see the simultaneous flourishing of Neoplatonism under figures including Plotinus, who is born in 204 AD, and whose Enneads represent the most sophisticated Greek philosophical engagement with the questions the Hermetic texts address. Plotinus himself, who studies in Alexandria under the philosopher Ammonius Saccas, before establishing his school in Rome around 244 AD, is deeply familiar with the Hermetic texts and engages with their cosmological framework throughout his own work. His student Porphyry, who is born in 234 AD and who edits and publishes the Enneads after Plotinus's death in 270 AD, records in his life of Plotinus that Hermetic texts were regularly discussed in Plotinus's seminars, though Plotinus himself maintained a critical distance from what he saw as their more extravagant cosmological claims. This critical distance is itself revealing. Plotinus is engaging with the Hermetic tradition seriously enough to critique it, which means the texts are present and active in the most significant philosophical circle of the 3rd century. Gnosticism, which shares with the Hermetic tradition a cosmological framework centered on archonic forces and the soul's liberation from material imprisonment, flourishes in Alexandria during the same period. The Gnostic teacher Valentinus, who is active in Alexandria and Rome in the 2nd century AD and who is one of the most significant figures in the early Gnostic movement, develops a cosmological system that parallels the Hermetic mapping of the archonic spheres with extraordinary precision. The Valentinian pleroma, the fullness of divine being from which the soul has fallen and to which it seeks to return, corresponds directly to the divine mind of the Hermetic poimandres. The Valentinian archons, who preside over the material world and who work to prevent the soul's return to the pleroma, are the same forces that the Hermetic tradition maps onto the 7 planetary spheres. The parallel is not coincidental. Both traditions draw on the same foundational transmission, the Egyptian mystery school lineage that Thoth encoded in the Hermetic texts. The figure of Hermes Trismegistus himself, as he appears in the texts, is simultaneously a historical teacher, a divine intelligence, and a transmission vehicle. The texts do not settle on a single consistent biography for him, because the point is not biographical, the point is the transmission. When the Corpus Hermeticum presents Hermes instructing his son Tat, or his student Asclepius, or receiving instruction from Poimandres, the specific historical identity of the participants is less important than the transmission that passes between them. The texts are structured as dialogues because dialogue is the technology of transmission, the back and forth movement through which the student's consciousness is drawn out of its habitual patterns and brought into contact with the living frequency of the teaching. The initiated bloodlines that preserve this transmission across the first 4 centuries of the Common Era represent a specific kind of human being, one who has recognized the archonic control system for what it is, has begun the work of dissolving the 7 seals, and has committed to preserving the technology for the souls who will come after. These are not academics. They are not religious professionals in the institutional sense. They are sovereign practitioners of the Hermetic science, carrying the frequency in their bodies as much as in the texts they copy and protect. When the Roman Imperial Church begins its systematic suppression of non-Christian religious practice in the late 4th century, these initiated souls make the decisions that will determine whether the transmission survives. Some of them make the right decisions. The Hermetic practitioner communities of Alexandria in the 3rd century AD are documented in the work of the Church Father Origen, who is born around 185 AD and who studies in Alexandria under Clement before establishing his own school there. Origins against Celsus, written around 248 AD in response to the pagan philosopher Celsus's critique of Christianity, references Hermetic communities operating openly in Alexandria and engaging in philosophical debate with both Christian and Neoplatonic thinkers. Celsus himself, writing around 178 AD, mentions the Hermetic tradition in terms that confirm its active presence in the intellectual life of Alexandria during the 2nd century. The Hermetic communities are not marginal or secretive in this period. They operate as recognized participants in the philosophical culture of the most intellectually vibrant city in the ancient world, holding public discussions, accepting students, and circulating their texts through the same networks that distribute the works of Plato, Aristotle, and the Stoics. The Nag Hammadi Library, discovered in Upper Egypt in December 1945, when a local farmer named Muhammad Ali al-Saman unearthed a sealed ceramic jar near the town of Nag Hammadi, contains a Coptic version of the Hermetic text known as the Discourse on the 8th and 9th, buried alongside Gnostic texts in a jar that had been sealed since approximately 350 AD. This discovery, which produces 13 leather-bound codices containing 52 texts, confirms that the Hermetic transmission was actively circulating in Egypt in the 4th century, informs that the initiated communities considered worth preserving at the cost of their lives. The jar was buried at a moment of acute danger, almost certainly in response to the same wave of imperial suppression that would destroy the Serapeum in 391 AD. The people who buried it knew they might not survive to retrieve it. They buried it anyway because the transmission mattered more than their safety. The Hermetic text, known as the Definitions of Hermes Trismegistus to Asclepius, preserved in an Armenian translation, discovered in the 19th century and published in a critical edition by Jean-Pierre Mar in 1982, provides additional evidence of the breadth of the Hermetic transmission across the ancient world. The Armenian definitions, which contain 49 short philosophical propositions attributed to Hermes, circulate in a linguistic and cultural environment entirely separate from the Greek-speaking world of Alexandria, confirming that the Hermetic transmission had penetrated into the Armenian Christian world through channels that the Theodosian suppression never fully closed. Mahay's critical edition, published by the Peters Press in Louvain, establishes that the Armenian definitions carry genuine Hermetic content that parallels the Greek corpus in its treatment of the soul's relationship to the divine mind, the nature of the body as a vehicle for ascending frequencies, and the specific quality of gnosis that the Hermetic transmission is designed to produce. The existence of the Armenian definitions confirms that the Hermetic tradition was not a purely Alexandrian phenomenon, but a genuinely Mediterranean-wide transmission that had established itself in communities as geographically distant from Alexandria as the Armenian highlands by the time the Theodosian suppression began its work of destruction. The architecture of the Corpus Hermeticum is not arbitrary. The sequence in which the 17 treatises are arranged, the specific progression from the opening cosmological vision of the Poimandres through the increasingly intimate and practical instructions of the later books, reflects a deliberate pedagogical design. Thoth encoded the liberation technology not only in the content of each individual treatise, but in the relationship between them, so that the reader who moves through the corpus in sequence undergoes a progressive activation of the soul's ascending frequencies. Reading sequence matters. The order is the technology. To approach the Corpus Hermeticum as a collection of philosophical texts to be read in any order, selected according to personal interest, or studied in fragments isolated from their context, is to miss the primary mechanism of the transmission. The 13 core treatises of the Greek corpus, which are the most tightly organized portion of the surviving Hermetic literature, function as discrete activation portals, each one calibrated to address a specific threshold in the soul's awakening process. Each treatise is a gate. Each gate opens onto the next. The soul that moves through them in sequence is not accumulating information. It is being progressively freed from the archonic seals that have kept it imprisoned in the material sphere. The first treatise, known as the Poimandres, from the name of the divine intelligence that transmits it, stands apart from all the others. The Poimandres is the foundational document, the original transmission, the account of the first direct contact between the human consciousness and the living mind that underlies all of creation. It is placed first in the sequence not because it was composed first, though the tradition treats it as the most ancient of the surviving texts, but because it establishes the cosmological and ontological framework that every subsequent treatise will build upon, deepen, and operationalize. The Poimandres opens in a state of interior silence. Hermes Trismegistus, in a condition of deep meditative receptivity, encounters a vast being that identifies itself as the mind of sovereignty, the divine intelligence that precedes and underlies all created existence. The vision that Poimandres then transmits covers the full arc of creation and dissolution, from the original light of the divine mind through the successive emanations that produce the material world, the descent of the soul through the 7 archonic spheres, the installation of the seals, the soul's imprisonment in the body, and the precise mechanism of liberation. The Poimandres does not offer this as mythology. It presents it as the direct account of what the soul undergoes, what it has forgotten, and what it can recover. The second treatise, known as the General Discourse, takes up the question of consciousness and the nature of the good, establishing the distinction between the soul that is oriented toward the divine intelligence and the soul that remains captured by the archonic system. The third treatise, the Sacred Discourse, addresses the nature of the created world and the relationship between divine, mind, and material form. These early treatises build the conceptual foundation that the later, more practically oriented books require. They are the map before the territory. The fourth treatise, the Mixing Bowl, or Crater, introduces one of the most significant of the Hermetic teachings. The idea that the divine mind has placed a mixing bowl in the world, filled with the divine substance, and that souls who seek it out are baptized in it, receiving the capacity for gnosis, for direct knowing of the divine nature. This is not a ritual baptism in the institutional religious sense. It is a frequency activation, a moment of direct contact between the soul's consciousness and the living intelligence of the divine mind. The mixing bowl is a portal. Thoth placed it in the world for the souls who are ready to find it. The fifth treatise addresses the question of how the divine mind can be said to be hidden while simultaneously being present everywhere in creation. The Hermetic answer is precise. The divine mind is not hidden in the sense of being absent or inaccessible. It is hidden in the sense of being so thoroughly present, so completely the ground of all existence, that the archonically sealed consciousness cannot perceive it. The seals installed during the soul's descent through the seven spheres specifically impair the faculties of perception that would allow the soul to recognize the divine intelligence it is swimming in. The liberation technology of the corpus is designed to restore these faculties, not to bring the soul into contact with something it has never known, but to remove the barriers that prevent the soul from recognizing what has always been present. The sixth treatise continues this line of inquiry, addressing the relationship between the good, which the Hermetic tradition identifies with the divine mind, and the apparent evil of the material world. The Hermetic position is not dualistic, in the sense of positing two equal and opposing forces. The archons are real, their control system is real, the suffering they cause in the souls they imprison is real. But the divine mind is more fundamental than the archonic system, and the soul that successfully completes the ascent through the seven spheres recovers a perspective from which the entire archonic drama is seen in its proper proportion. The seventh treatise, known as the greatest evil among men is ignorance of God, addresses directly the central mechanism of archonic control. Not violence, not direct coercion, but ignorance. The archons maintain the material prison not primarily through force, but through the soul's own ignorance of its nature. The soul that does not know what it is cannot take the steps that would free it. The soul that mistakes the archonic implants for its own genuine character is cooperating with its own imprisonment without knowing it does so. The seventh treatise is a confrontation with this mechanism, a direct naming of the ignorance that sustains the prison, and an invitation to the reader to recognize it in their own experience. The eighth treatise addresses the nature of the soul's faculties and the relationship between the soul and the body, establishing the Hermetic understanding of the body as a vehicle that contains hidden gateways, the pineal, the thymus, the vagus point, the third eye, through which the soul can access frequencies that transcend the material sphere. The body is not the enemy in the Hermetic framework. The body is a tool that the archons have convinced the soul to misuse, directing its energies downward into material craving and archonic feeding rather than upward through the hidden gateways toward the divine intelligence. The ninth treatise, known as On Thought and Sense, deepens the analysis of the soul's perceptual faculties, distinguishing between the distorted perception produced by the archonically sealed consciousness and the clear, direct perception of the soul that has begun to dissolve the seals. The 10th treatise, The Key, provides what the tradition treats as a summary of the Hermetic teaching for the intermediate student, a consolidation of the foundational principles before the transmission moves into its most advanced territory. The title of this 10th treatise is significant. It is called The Key because it functions as the hinge between the preparatory and the advanced portions of the corpus, the point at which the student who has absorbed the first 9 gates is given the master principle that unlocks the final 3. The 11th treatise, known as Mind to Hermes, presents a direct transmission from the divine mind to Hermes that addresses the nature of cosmic consciousness, the relationship between time, eternity, and the soul's capacity to expand beyond its material confinement. The 12th treatise, On the Common Mind, addresses the relationship between the individual soul and the universal intelligence, establishing the Hermetic teaching that the soul's liberation is not an individual achievement in the competitive sense, but a return to the universal frequency from which it was never truly separated. And then there is the 13th treatise. The Corpus Hermeticum builds across 12 gates to the 13th, which is the most intimately structured, the most technically specific, and the most directly operational of all the surviving Hermetic texts. Corpus Hermeticum, the 13th, is the treatise on the secret rebirth, the account of the transformation that Hermes transmits to his son Tat in a single night of direct instruction. The 13th treatise is placed last in the sequence of the core corpus, not as an afterthought, but as the destination. Everything that precedes it is preparation. Everything that follows it in the broader collection is commentary and elaboration. Ch 13th is the crown of the architecture. The 7 spheres that the corpus maps in sequence across its 13 core treatises correspond to the 7 archonic seals installed during the soul's descent. The progression of the corpus is designed to address each seal in turn, providing the specific frequency and instruction required to begin dissolving that layer of archonic control before moving to the next. This is why reading sequence matters. A reader who begins with Ch 13th, without having moved through the preceding 12 treatises, will encounter the text at a surface level, receiving its intellectual content without activating the deeper mechanism of the transmission. The soul needs to have moved through the preparatory gates before the 13th can function at its full operational capacity. The moon sphere, the first and outermost archonic layer, is addressed in the early cosmological treatises that establish the soul's understanding of its situation. The archonic seal of covetousness, the compulsive reaching for external objects, is the most superficial of the 7 layers, the first to be encountered in the ascent and the first to be dissolved through the Hermetic technology. The Mercury sphere's seal of falsehood is addressed in the treatises that confront the soul's capacity for self-deception. The Venus sphere's seal of desire is worked with in the treatises that distinguish genuine spiritual longing from its archonic counterfeit. The Sun sphere's seal of arrogance is addressed in the treatises that progressively dismantle the ego's identification with itself as the true self. The Mars sphere's seal of rashness is worked with in the treatises that redirect the soul's creative fire from destructive to ascending purposes. The Jupiter sphere's seal of greed is addressed in the treatises that reorient the soul's expansion drive from material accumulation to genuine spiritual growth. And the Saturn sphere, the innermost and most powerful archonic seal, the one that installs malice, the deep distortion that poisons the soul's relationship to its own nature and to the divine intelligence, is the subject of the 13th treatise's climactic transmission. The dissolution of the Saturn seal is what the Corpus Hermeticum has been building toward across all 12 preceding gates. It is the deepest layer of the archonic prison. It is the one that the system of suppression has worked hardest to prevent the soul from reaching. The Saturn seal is the reason the Corpus Hermeticum was targeted, buried, burned, mislabeled, and discredited across 16 centuries of archonic management of human consciousness. The architecture of the corpus reflects Thoth's understanding that the liberation technology must be graduated, that the soul cannot be handed the 13th treatise without preparation, any more than a practitioner can be handed the most advanced stage of a technical training without having completed the foundational stages. The 13 gates are not arbitrary, they are calibrated. Each one opens the soul to the next level of frequency. Each one dissolves one more layer of archonic conditioning. Each one brings the reader closer to the direct experience of the divine mind that the Poimandres describes in its foundational vision. The Hermetic practitioners who circulate the Corpus Hermeticum in Alexandria during the first 3 centuries of the Common Era understand this architecture and teach it accordingly. Students do not begin with the 13th treatise. They begin with the Poimandres, move through the sequence, and arrive at Ch 13 only when the preparatory work has been completed. The initiated teachers of the Hermetic schools in Alexandria, in Memphis, in Heliopolis, and in the mystery school networks that extend across the Greek-speaking Mediterranean world know that the sequence is the technology. They protect this knowledge as carefully as they protect the texts themselves. The suppression that comes in the late 4th century targets not only the physical texts, but this living pedagogical tradition, the initiated teachers who know the sequence, who can guide the student through the gates, who carry the frequency in their bodies as well as their libraries. The burning of the texts is one dimension of the archonic assault. The killing and dispersal of the initiated teachers is another. The systematic destruction of the mystery school networks that provide the living context in which the texts function at their full operational capacity is the third. The scholar Brian Copenhaver, whose 1992 Cambridge University Press edition of the Corpus Hermeticum remains the standard English scholarly translation, notes in his introduction that the 13 core treatises display a structural coherence that cannot be accounted for by the theory of random compilation. Copenhaver identifies what he calls a progressive intensification of the soteriological content across the sequence, a pattern in which each successive treatise addresses a more interior and more operationally specific dimension of the liberation process than the one preceding it. This observation, made from within the framework of conventional classical scholarship, confirms what the Hermetic tradition has always maintained. The sequence is deliberate, the architecture is intentional, and the progression from the Poimandres to Ch13th is the technology itself, not merely the container for it. The Asclepius, which is the longest of the surviving Hermetic texts, and which circulates in a Latin translation attributed to the circle of Apuleius of Madaura, a 2nd century North African philosopher and rhetorician, provides an additional dimension of the Hermetic architecture that the 13 core Greek treatises do not fully address. The Asclepius deals extensively with the question of the animated statue, the temple image that has been charged with divine presence through the Hermetic technology of theurgy, and with the relationship between the material world and the divine intelligence that underlies it. The passage of the Asclepius, known as the Lament, in which Hermes prophesies the future destruction of Egyptian religion and the loss of the sacred knowledge, is one of the most haunting passages in the entire Hermetic corpus, a text that reads, in the context of the subsequent history of suppression, as a precise prediction of what was about to happen to the tradition that produced it. The Neoplatonist philosopher Iamblichus, writing in his De Mysteriis around 300 AD, provides one of the most detailed surviving accounts of how the initiated pedagogical sequence actually functioned in practice. Iamblichus describes a graduated system of instruction in which students are introduced to increasingly advanced levels of the transmission only after demonstrating specific interior capacities developed through the preceding stages. The student who has not dissolved the moon sphere's covetousness implant cannot receive the Mercury sphere's instruction without the archonic distortion of falsehood corrupting the transmission. The student who has not dissolved the Mercury implant cannot receive the Venus instruction without desire hijacking the genuine longing that the Venus work is designed to restore. The sequence is not merely pedagogical in the conventional sense. It is architecturally necessary. Each gate prepares the interior conditions that make the next gate operative. Iamblichus's account confirms that the Hermetic mystery schools of Alexandria understood this architecture with a precision that the surviving texts alone, stripped of their living pedagogical context, can only partially convey. The Stobaeus anthology, compiled by the 5th century Byzantine scholar Johannes Stobaeus, and preserved in a manuscript tradition that runs through the medieval period largely independent of the main Corpus Hermeticum transmission, contains an additional 29 Hermetic excerpts, known collectively as the Hermetic excerpts or the Stobaean fragments. These fragments, which Stobaeus preserves in his Anthologium alongside excerpts from Plato, Aristotle, and the Stoics, provide additional evidence of the breadth and depth of the Hermetic literary tradition beyond the 13 core treatises. Several of the Stobaean fragments address the seven-sphere architecture in terms that complement and extend the treatment in the main corpus, providing additional operational detail about the specific qualities of consciousness associated with each sphere and the specific practices through which each archonic seal can be approached for dissolution. The survival of the Stobaean fragments through the Byzantine manuscript tradition, entirely separate from the main Corpus Hermeticum transmission, confirms that the Hermetic literature was sufficiently widespread in the ancient world that multiple independent preservation channels could carry different portions of it forward through the centuries of suppression. 391 AD, Alexandria. The Emperor Theodosius I issues a series of imperial edicts that collectively constitute the most sweeping suppression of non-Christian religious practice in the history of the Roman Empire. The Edict of Thessalonica, issued in 380 AD, has already established Nicene Christianity as the sole legitimate religion of the Roman state. The edicts of 391 AD take the next step, explicitly outlawing the practice of all traditional religious forms, closing the temples, prohibiting sacrifice, and making the continued possession and circulation of non-Christian sacred texts a matter of criminal liability. The context in which these edicts are issued is one of accumulated imperial pressure on the religious diversity that had characterized the Roman world for centuries. The Ptolemaic mystery school tradition, the Neoplatonic philosophical schools, the Gnostic communities, the Hermetic networks, all of these had survived the first 3 centuries of Christian presence in the Roman Empire by operating in parallel to the institutional church, serving communities of practitioners who found the Christian theological framework insufficient for their spiritual work. The Hermetic texts had circulated openly in Alexandria, Memphis, and Rome itself during this period, read and studied by educated practitioners, who experienced no fundamental conflict between Hermetic philosophy and other intellectual or spiritual commitments. Figures including Clement of Alexandria, who is active around 200 AD, and Lactantius, who writes in the early 4th century, quote, the Hermetic texts approvingly, treating Hermes Trismegistus as a pagan prophet who had anticipated Christian truths. This early Christian engagement with the Hermetic tradition represents a period of relative tolerance that the edicts of 391 AD bring to an abrupt end. The specific targeting of Alexandria in the wave of destruction that follows the 391 AD edicts is not accidental. Alexandria is the center of the living Hermetic transmission, the city where the mystery school networks are most densely concentrated, where the most complete collections of Hermetic texts are held, and where the initiated teachers who can guide students through the sequence of the corpus are most numerous. The Serapeum, the great temple complex dedicated to Serapis, the syncretic deity who combined Egyptian and Greek religious elements in a form specifically designed to serve the Ptolemaic project of cultural synthesis, is the physical center of this living tradition. Its library, which holds a significant portion of the texts that had been displaced or copied from the main library of Alexandria, is the archive that the initiated communities depend upon for the preservation and circulation of the Hermetic transmission. In 391 AD, the Serapeum is attacked by a Christian mob acting under the authority of Theophilus, the Bishop of Alexandria, who holds this position from 385 AD to 412 AD. Theophilus is one of the most aggressive enforcers of the Theodosian suppression of non-Christian practice, and his campaign against the Serapeum represents the intersection of imperial law and ecclesiastical authority in a form that the Hermetic communities have no institutional mechanism to resist. The temple is destroyed. Its library is burned. The initiated priests who had maintained the living transmission within its walls are killed, dispersed, or driven underground. The physical archive of the Hermetic tradition in Alexandria suffers a blow from which it will not recover in any publicly accessible form. The historical record of the Serapeum's destruction is documented by multiple contemporary sources, including the church historian Rufinus of Aquileia, who writes in his ecclesiastical history, completed around 403 AD. That the destruction of the Serapeum was carried out by a Christian crowd inflamed by Theophilus's preaching, and that the temple's contents, including its library, were systematically destroyed. The pagan historian Eunapius of Sardis, writing in his Lives of the Philosophers and Sophists around 395 AD, describes the destruction of the Serapeum with evident grief, recording that the initiated teachers, who had maintained the tradition within its walls, were scattered across the Mediterranean world, carrying the fragments of the transmission in their memories, and in whatever manuscripts they could conceal. Eunapius himself is a student of the Neoplatonic tradition, and writes from within the initiated philosophical world that the Theodosian suppression is destroying. His account carries the weight of a witness. The scale of what is lost in the burning of the Serapeum's library is difficult to quantify precisely, but the historian Orosius, writing around 415 AD, refers to the library of the Serapeum as containing daughter collections from the main library of Alexandria, suggesting that the Serapeum held copies of texts that had been produced or acquired by the main library over its 3-century history. The church historian Socrates Scholasticus, writing his ecclesiastical history in the early 5th century, describes the destruction of the Serapeum in detail, noting that the temple's contents were removed and its structure demolished on the orders of Theophilus. But the Hermetic transmission wasn't done yet, not even close. The initiated bloodlines who carried the frequency in their bodies, who had memorized the key passages of the corpus, who understood the sequence and the technology, had been preparing for this moment. The burning of the Serapeum's library is a catastrophic loss, but it is not the end of the transmission. Copies of the Hermetic texts had been distributed across the Mediterranean world through the mystery school networks, held in private collections, memorized by initiated practitioners, and carried in forms that the imperial suppression could not easily locate or destroy. The archonic strategy, deployed through the Theodosian edicts and the Theodosian Church, is not primarily one of physical destruction, though physical destruction is one of its instruments. The deeper strategy is relabeling. The Hermetic texts, along with the broader corpus of Gnostic, Neoplatonic, and mystery school literature, are systematically relabeled as magic. This is a precise and deliberate move. In the Roman imperial framework, magic is not merely a category of superstition. It is a criminal category, carrying penalties that range from exile to execution. By relabeling the Hermetic texts as magical rather than philosophical or religious, the Imperial Church creates a legal framework for the suppression of anyone who possesses, copies, circulates, or teaches from them. The Hermetic science of consciousness, the liberation technology that Thoth encoded in the corpus, is criminalized not because it is dangerous to the individual practitioner, but because it is dangerous to the archonic control system that the Imperial Church serves. The legal mechanism through which this criminalization operates is the Theodosian Code, the comprehensive compilation of Roman imperial law assembled under Theodosius II between 429 AD and 438 AD. The Theodosian Code contains multiple provisions targeting magical practice, defining it in terms broad enough to encompass virtually any non-Christian ritual or spiritual technology. Title 16 of the Code, which deals with religious law, contains 42 laws issued between 313 AD and 435 AD that progressively restrict and then eliminate non-Christian religious practice. The sheer volume of legislation required to suppress the traditional religious world of the Roman Empire is itself revealing. The archonic strategy requires sustained institutional effort across more than a century, because the transmission it is targeting is genuinely resilient, genuinely distributed, and genuinely alive in the bodies and memories of the practitioners who carry it. Theophilus of Alexandria is succeeded in 412 AD by his nephew Cyril, who holds the position of Bishop of Alexandria from 412 AD to 444 AD. Cyril's tenure represents the consolidation and intensification of the suppression that Theophilus had initiated. Cyril is a figure of extraordinary institutional aggression, a man who deploys the full weight of his ecclesiastical authority to eliminate every competing spiritual tradition in Alexandria. His campaign against the Jewish community of Alexandria in 415 AD, which results in the expulsion of tens of thousands of Jewish residents from the city, demonstrates the scale and ferocity of his suppression strategy. The same year, the murder of Hypatia of Alexandria, the mathematician, philosopher, and Neoplatonic teacher who is dragged from her carriage by a Christian mob, killed, and dismembered in the streets of Alexandria, marks the effective end of the publicly operating philosophical and mystery school tradition in the city. Hypatia is not herself a Hermetic practitioner in the strict sense, but she represents the broader tradition of initiated philosophical teaching that the Hermetic transmission depends upon for its living context. Her murder sends an unambiguous message to every initiated teacher remaining in Alexandria. The era of open transmission has ended. Hypatia's death is documented by multiple contemporary sources, including the church historian Socrates Scholasticus, who writes in his ecclesiastical history that she was torn apart by the mob and her body burned. She is estimated to have been in her late 40s or early 50s at the time of her death, a figure at the height of her intellectual authority, attracting students from across the Mediterranean world to her lectures on Platonic philosophy and mathematics. Among her documented students is Synesius of Cyrene, who later becomes Bishop of Ptolemais, and who maintains a correspondence with Hypatia that survives in his collected letters, providing one of the most intimate portraits of the teacher-student relationship in the ancient philosophical world. The loss of Hypatia represents not only the death of an individual, but the destruction of a living pedagogical lineage, the kind of initiated teacher-student transmission that the Hermetic tradition depends upon for its full operational capacity. When Hypatia dies, the chain of living transmission in Alexandria is broken in a way that no manuscript can fully repair. The relabeling strategy deployed by the Imperial Church is particularly effective in the long term because it shapes the way subsequent generations encounter the Hermetic texts. A practitioner who approaches the Corpus Hermeticum having been told that it is a collection of magical texts, condemned by legitimate religious and philosophical authority, approaches it with a different interior state than one who approaches it as the foundational document of a living liberation technology. The archonic management of consciousness works through exactly this kind of framing, installing the seal of dismissal before the soul has had the chance to encounter the actual frequency of the text. The Roman Imperial Church uses Roman law as its instrument in precisely the way that the Hermetic tradition understands archonic forces to operate. Through the structures and institutions of the material world, through legal frameworks and social authority, through the criminalizing of liberation and the normalizing of imprisonment, Theodosius I is not, in the Hermetic reading of this history, simply a politically motivated emperor making pragmatic decisions about religious unity. He is the instrument of an archonic strategy that has been in operation across the entire history of Western civilization, a strategy aimed at preventing the soul from accessing the technology that would free it from the material prison. The consequence of the 391 AD suppression and its aftermath is a fundamental disruption of the living Hermetic transmission in the West. The initiated teachers are gone or in hiding. The mystery school networks are broken. The physical archives are burned or scattered. The texts that survive do so in forms that are increasingly divorced from the living pedagogical context that makes them fully operational. A copy of the Corpus Hermeticum held by a practitioner who does not know the sequence, who has not received the preparatory instruction, who does not understand the relationship between the 13 gates and the 7 archonic seals, is a text that carries the frequency of the transmission in a latent form but cannot fully activate it. The archonic suppression has not destroyed the technology. It has disrupted the transmission chain that would allow it to operate at its full capacity. The Hermetic communities that survived the 5th century carry this disrupted transmission forward into the darker centuries that follow. The Nag Hammadi jar, sealed around 350 AD and buried in the Egyptian desert, stands as the physical evidence of exactly how far the initiated communities were willing to go to preserve what the archonic suppression was trying to erase. 13 codices, 52 texts, sealed in ceramic and left for whoever would come next. That is not the behavior of a tradition that has given up. That is the behavior of a tradition that knows the transmission is bigger than any single generation's ability to protect it. The Coptic monastery of St. Pachomius, which operates near the site of the Nag Hammadi discovery in the Thebaid region of Upper Egypt, is the most likely institutional context for the burial of the Nag Hammadi library. According to the scholarly analysis of Frederick Wisser and James Robinson, published in their introduction to the Nag Hammadi library in English, the monastery, founded by Pachomius of Tabanisi around 320 AD and expanded significantly under his successors, represents a community where Coptic Christian monasticism and the older Egyptian initiated traditions existed in close proximity, and where the decision to preserve Gnostic and Hermetic texts alongside canonical Christian literature reflects the complexity of the religious landscape in 4th century Upper Egypt. The ceramic jar in which the codices were buried, which measures approximately 60 centimeters in height and which was sealed with a bowl used as a lid, was of a type commonly used in the region for storage of valuable objects. The decision to seal it and bury it, rather than simply hide it in the monastery's library, confirms that the people who made this choice understood that the danger they faced was not temporary. They were burying the transmission for a future they could not see. The centuries that follow the Theodosian suppression and the destruction of the Alexandrian mystery school tradition represent the longest and most thorough archonic management of Western consciousness in recorded history. From approximately 500 AD to 1200 AD, the living Hermetic transmission in the Latin West is effectively silenced, not destroyed, because the frequency Thoth encoded in the texts cannot be permanently extinguished, but buried under 7 centuries of enforced theological authority, legal prohibition, and systematic relabeling of the liberation technology as diabolical practice. The early medieval period is characterized by the consolidation of Christian institutional authority across the former territories of the Western Roman Empire. As Roman administrative structures collapse in the 5th and 6th centuries, the Church emerges as the primary institutional continuity, providing the legal frameworks, the educational systems, and the intellectual authority that hold together the fragmenting social fabric of post-Roman Europe. Within this institutional framework, the category of acceptable knowledge is defined with increasing precision and exclusivity. Philosophy, science, and spiritual practice are all brought within the orbit of Christian theological authority, and anything that falls outside that orbit is subject to the same relabeling strategy that the Theodosian edicts had deployed: magic, heresy, diabolical influence. The Hermetic texts that circulate in the Latin West during the early medieval period are fragments, pieces of the broader transmission stripped of their context and their sequence. The Asclepius, one of the longer Hermetic dialogues, survives in a Latin translation attributed to the circle of Apuleius of Madaura, who is active in the 2nd century AD, and it circulates through the medieval period as a somewhat anomalous philosophical text, tolerated in part because its Latin dress makes it less obviously foreign, and in part because certain passages of it can be read as compatible with Christian cosmological categories. But the Greek Corpus Hermeticum itself, the 13 core treatises with their explicit mapping of the archonic prison and the liberation technology of the seven-sphere ascent, is absent from the Latin West for these 7 centuries. The fragments of Hermetic teaching that survive in the Latin West during this period do so primarily through their incorporation into the work of early Christian theologians who engage with the tradition ambivalently, citing Hermes Trismegistus as a pagan prophet while simultaneously stripping his teaching of its operational content. Augustine of Hippo, writing in the early 5th century, quotes from the Asclepius but condemns its magical practices. Augustine's City of God, completed around 426 AD, contains one of the most significant early Christian engagements with the Hermetic tradition, in which Augustine acknowledges the genuine antiquity and wisdom of Hermes Trismegistus, while systematically neutralizing the liberatory implications of his teaching. Augustine quotes the Asclepius's lament over the future destruction of Egyptian religion with apparent sympathy, then pivots to argue that this destruction was divinely ordained, and that the demons, Hermes describes as the animating forces of Egyptian temple statues, are precisely the kind of diabolical entities that Christian authority is right to suppress. This is the archonic management strategy at its most sophisticated. Acknowledge the surface of the teaching, absorb it into the dominant theological framework, and neutralize its operational core. You'd think someone would have said something. Nobody did. The initiated practitioners who understood what was being lost, who recognized the systematic neutralization of the Hermetic liberation technology and the theological frameworks being constructed around it, had no institutional voice in the Latin West during this period. They operated in silence, in private, in the small initiated circles that maintained the living frequency of the transmission in the only way available to them. Through direct transmission between teacher and student, without texts, without institutions, without any publicly visible presence. The situation in the Arabic-speaking world during this same period is significantly different. The Islamic scholarly tradition that emerges in the 7th and 8th centuries is, in its early phases, characterized by a remarkable openness to the intellectual heritage of the ancient world. The translation movement centered in Baghdad under the Abbasid Caliphate, particularly during the reign of Caliph Harun al-Rashid from 786 AD to 809 AD, and his son al-Ma'mun from 813 AD to 833 AD, produces Arabic translations of Greek philosophical and scientific texts on a scale that has no parallel in the Latin West of the same period. The House of Wisdom, Bait al-Hikmah, established in Baghdad under al-Ma'mun, employs hundreds of translators and scholars working simultaneously on the Greek philosophical and scientific heritage, producing Arabic versions of Aristotle, Plato, Galen, Ptolemy, and a range of Neoplatonic and Hermetic texts. The scale of this translation project is staggering. Within a century, virtually the entire surviving corpus of Greek philosophy and science is available in Arabic, while the Latin West has access to only a fraction of the same material. Within this translation movement, the Hermetic texts occupy a significant position. The Sabian community of Harran, a city in what is now southeastern Turkey, plays a particularly important role in the preservation and transmission of the Hermetic tradition during this period. The Sabians of Harran are a religious community whose practices center on the veneration of the heavenly bodies and whose intellectual tradition draws directly on the Neoplatonic and Hermetic heritage of the ancient world. When the Islamic expansion reaches Harran in the 7th century, the Sabians negotiate a protected status under Islamic law by presenting themselves as a people of the book, a recognized religious community with a legitimate scriptural tradition. Their scripture, they claim, is the Hermetic corpus. This claim, whether pragmatic or sincere, has the effect of placing the Hermetic tradition under the protection of Islamic religious law during a period when it has no equivalent protection in the Latin West. The Sabian community of Harran becomes one of the primary vehicles through which the Hermetic transmission survives the medieval period, contributing to the Arabic translation movement and preserving fragments of the original Greek corpus that would otherwise have been lost. The Sabian scholar Thabit ibn Qurra, born in Harran around 836 AD, is among the most prolific translators of the House of Wisdom, producing Arabic versions of Greek mathematical and astronomical texts, while maintaining the Hermetic cosmological framework as the intellectual foundation of his work. His presence in Baghdad's translation movement confirms that the Hermetic tradition was not merely surviving in Iran as a local curiosity, but was actively shaping the most significant intellectual project of the 9th century. Islamic world. The Arabic Hermetic literature that develops from the 8th century onward includes texts that carry the operational content of the Hermetic liberation technology in forms adapted for the Arabic-speaking world. The Kitab al-Ustuwatas, the Picatrix in its later Latin translation, and a range of astrological and alchemical texts that circulate under the authority of Hermes Trismegistus, all represent the continuation of the Hermetic transmission in the Arabic-speaking world during the centuries when it is effectively absent from the Latin West. The Picatrix itself, which is translated into Latin in 1256 at the court of Alfonso I of Castile, represents one of the primary channels through which Arabic Hermetic material eventually re-enters the Latin West, carrying the seven-sphere cosmology and the archonic framework in a form that, while encoded in the language of astrological magic, preserves the foundational structure of the liberation technology. The scholastic theology that dominates the Latin West from the 11th century onward represents the most systematic attempt yet to incorporate the philosophical heritage of the ancient world into a Christian theological framework that neutralizes its liberatory implications. The work of Thomas Aquinas, who lives from 1225 to 1274, represents the culmination of this project, synthesizing Aristotelian philosophy with Christian theology in a framework so comprehensive and so institutionally powerful that it becomes the intellectual authority of the Latin Church for centuries. Within this framework, the Hermetic tradition has no place. It is not simply ignored, it is actively excluded. Its categories of consciousness, archonic control, and soul liberation incompatible with the theological framework that Aquinas constructs. The Inquisition, formally established by Pope Gregory IX in 1231 and expanded significantly in the late 13th and 14th centuries, creates an institutional mechanism for the enforcement of this theological authority through legal terror. Anyone holding Hermetic texts, practicing Hermetic techniques, or teaching the Hermetic liberation technology is subject to investigation, trial, and punishment ranging from public humiliation to execution. The records of inquisitorial proceedings from the 13th through the 16th centuries document numerous cases in which individuals are prosecuted for possession of texts that carry Hermetic content, labeled as magical or diabolical, by inquisitorial authorities who have no interest in distinguishing the liberation technology of the corpus from the low magic of folk practice. The trial records of the Inquisition at Carcassonne, which date from the 1240s onward and which are among the most complete surviving inquisitorial archives, document the systematic prosecution of Cathar communities in southern France, whose cosmological framework, with its mapping of material world forces hostile to the soul's liberation, carries unmistakable resonances of the Hermetic archonic teaching. Whether these communities had direct access to Hermetic texts or were drawing on a parallel oral transmission is a question that the surviving records cannot definitively answer, but the structural parallel between Cathar dualism and Hermetic archanology is precise enough to confirm that the liberation technology was finding its way through the medieval darkness in multiple simultaneous channels. The philosopher Proclus, who is born in Constantinople in 412 AD and who leads the Platonic Academy in Athens from approximately 450 AD until his death in 485 AD, represents one of the last major figures of the publicly operating Neoplatonic tradition in the ancient world. His Platonic theology and his commentaries on Plato's dialogues preserve significant elements of the Hermetic cosmological framework within the institutional context of the Athenian Academy, encoding the seven-sphere architecture and the archonic analysis in the language of Platonic philosophy. When the Emperor Justinian I formally closes the Platonic Academy in Athens in 529 AD, ordering its pagan philosophers to cease teaching, the last publicly operating institutional home of the ancient philosophical tradition in the Roman world is extinguished. The seven philosophers who had been leading the academy, including Damascius, who serves as its final head, and Simplicius, whose commentaries on Aristotle will become foundational texts of medieval philosophy, leave Athens and travel to the court of the Sassanid Persian king Khosrow I, carrying their manuscripts and their living transmission with them into the Persian world. This eastward migration of the Athenian philosophers in 529 AD is one of the most consequential intellectual events of the early medieval period, placing the living Hermetic and Neoplatonic transmission in direct contact with the Persian scholarly tradition that will eventually feed into the Arabic translation movement of the 8th and 9th centuries. The chain of transmission that runs from the Alexandrian mystery schools through the Athenian academy to the Persian court and then into the House of Wisdom in Baghdad is not broken. It is rerouted, moving through the only corridors that the archonic suppression has left open. The Saturn seal, the deepest archonic installation, the one that installs malice and poisons the soul's relationship to its own nature, tightens across Western consciousness during these 7 centuries of Hermetic silence. A civilization that has been systematically deprived of the liberation technology for 700 years does not simply remain static, it degrades. The archonic seals that the Hermetic technology was designed to dissolve accumulate additional layers, additional reinforcement, additional cultural and institutional structures that normalize the soul's imprisonment and make the very concept of liberation appear either dangerous or incomprehensible. The clock was already ticking. The Hermetic transmission in the Arabic world just couldn't hear it yet. For a while, things actually seemed fine. Certain Hermetic ideas, filtered through the acceptable categories of Christian mysticism, found expression in the work of figures like Hildegard of Bingen, who lives from 1098 to 1179, and Meister Eckhart, who lives from approximately 1260 to 1328, whose mystical theology carries resonances of the Hermetic teaching about the soul's direct access to the divine intelligence. That didn't last. Both figures faced ecclesiastical censure for the implications of their teaching. Eckhart posthumously, his work condemned by Pope John XXI in 1329, 2 years after Eckhart's death. The archonic management of consciousness does not permit even the filtered, Christianized resonances of the Hermetic transmission to operate freely within the institutional framework of the Latin Church. 1463, Florence. A Macedonian monk named Leonardo da Pistoia arrives in the city carrying a Greek manuscript that has traveled from Macedonia to the center of the Italian Renaissance. The manuscript contains the Greek text of the Corpus Hermeticum, the first complete copy of the foundational Hermetic transmission to reach the Latin West in over 1,000 years. The man who receives it, Cosimo de' Medici, is 74 years old and dying. He has perhaps months to live. What he does with the manuscript in those final months will ignite a transformation of European consciousness that the archonic suppression has spent 7 centuries trying to prevent. Cosimo de' Medici, who is born in Florence in 1389, and who has served as the de facto ruler of the Florentine Republic since 1434, is in 1463 a figure at the end of a life of extraordinary cultural and political achievement. His banking empire, the Medici Bank, which operates branches across Europe from London to Rome, has made him the wealthiest man in Europe and provided the financial foundation for his patronage of the arts and learning that has already transformed Florence into the most intellectually vibrant city on the continent. Cosimo has, for decades, been pursuing a vision of cultural renewal, centered on the recovery and translation of the Greek philosophical heritage, a project that he has supported through the financing of manuscript hunters across the Greek-speaking world and the establishment of what will become the Platonic Academy of Florence, a gathering of the most significant philosophical minds of the Italian Renaissance. The Platonic Academy, which Cosimo conceives as the revival of Plato's original school in Athens, is his most ambitious cultural project, and its intellectual leadership is entrusted to Marsilio Ficino, who is born in 1433 in Figline Valdarno, a small town in the Florentine territory, and who comes to Cosimo's attention as a young man of exceptional philosophical and linguistic gifts. Ficino has been working for years on the translation of the complete works of Plato from Greek into Latin, a project that Cosimo has commissioned and that represents the most ambitious single translation project of the Renaissance. By 1463, Ficino is 30 years old, deeply immersed in the Platonic corpus, and preparing for what he and Cosimo both understand as the definitive work of philosophical translation for their era. When Leonardo da Pistoia arrives in Florence with the Greek manuscript of the Corpus Hermeticum in 1463, Cosimo makes an immediate and decisive choice. He instructs Ficino to set aside the Plato translation and begin translating the Hermetic manuscript immediately. The reason Cosimo gives, as recorded in the correspondence of the period, is that he wishes to read the work of Hermes Trismegistus before he dies. Cosimo de' Medici, who has spent decades acquiring and commissioning the translation of the Greek philosophical heritage, recognizes instantly that the manuscript Leonardo has brought from Macedonia represents something different from the Platonic texts Ficino has been working on. He recognizes it as a priority. He recognizes it as urgent. And this is the part where things stopped being funny. Ficino, who has been working on Plato for years, who has the full Platonic corpus ready for translation, who understands himself to be engaged in the defining intellectual project of the Renaissance, sets it aside at Cosimo's instruction and turns immediately to the Hermetic manuscript. This is not a minor reorientation. It is a fundamental statement about the relative priority of the two traditions. Cosimo de' Medici, the most powerful cultural patron in Europe, has decided that Hermes Trismegistus comes before Plato. The implications of this decision for the subsequent history of Renaissance philosophy and for the recovery of the Hermetic transmission in the West are profound. Ficino completes his Latin translation of the Corpus Hermeticum, which he titles the Pimanda, after the first treatise, in 1463, working with extraordinary speed, driven by the urgency of Cosimo's condition. Cosimo de' Medici dies in August 1464, having read Ficino's translation in the final months of his life. The translation is first printed in 1471 in Treviso, making it one of the earliest printed books in Europe, and it circulates rapidly across the continent through the networks of humanist scholars and initiated practitioners who have been waiting across 7 centuries of enforced silence for exactly this moment. Between 1471 and 1500, Ficino's translation goes through at least 16 printed editions, an extraordinary rate of distribution for any text in this period, reflecting the pent-up demand of a European intellectual and spiritual community starved for the Hermetic transmission. The impact of the Pimanda's publication on the intellectual life of the Italian Renaissance is immediate and transformative. Ficino himself, whose subsequent work on Platonic philosophy is deeply informed by his engagement with the Hermetic texts, produces a series of works that blend Platonic philosophy with Hermetic teaching in ways that create the distinctive synthesis known as Renaissance Neoplatonism. His Theologia Platonica, composed between 1469 and 1474, and his De Vita, published in 1489, both carry the imprint of the Hermetic transmission in their treatment of the soul's ascent, the relationship between the human and divine intelligence, and the practical techniques available to the practitioner who seeks to activate the soul's ascending frequencies. The De Vita in particular, which is subtitled On Making Your Life Agree with the Heavens, is a practical manual for working with the 7 planetary spheres in a way that maps directly onto the Hermetic liberation technology of the corpus. Ficino is not simply translating the Hermetic texts. He is living them, applying their technology to his own practice and encoding the results in his subsequent philosophical work. Giovanni Pico della Mirandola, who is born in 1463, the same year that Leonardo da Pistoia arrives in Florence with the Hermetic manuscript, represents the next generation of the Hermetic Renaissance. Pico's oration on the dignity of man, composed in 1486 as the introduction to his 900 Conclusions, is one of the most famous documents of the Italian Renaissance, and it carries the Hermetic teaching about the soul's capacity for self-transformation as its central philosophical claim. Pico is also one of the first Christian scholars to engage systematically with Kabbalah, which he reads as a parallel tradition carrying the same foundational liberation technology as the Hermetic corpus. His synthesis of Hermeticism, Neoplatonism, and Kabbalah creates the intellectual framework known as Christian Kabbalah or the Hermetic Kabbalistic tradition, which will be one of the primary vehicles through which the Hermetic transmission circulates in the subsequent century. Pico's 900 Conclusions, which he proposes to defend in public debate in Rome in January 1487, include a significant number of Hermetic and Kabbalistic theses that the Papal Commission convened to examine them finds heretical. Pope Innocent VIII suspends the planned debate in March 1487 and eventually condemns 13 of Pico's 900 theses as heretical. Pico flees to France, is arrested at the request of the papal nuncio, and is eventually released through the intervention of Lorenzo de' Medici, Cosimo's grandson, who has by this point assumed the patronage role that Cosimo had established. The episode illustrates with precision the archonic management strategy of the late 15th century. The Hermetic transmission has been recovered and is circulating, but the institutional church is still actively working to contain and suppress its most operationally specific expressions. The broader impact of the Hermetic Renaissance extends far beyond the Florentine Platonic Academy and its immediate circle. The recovery of the Corpus Hermeticum and its rapid dissemination through print creates a new intellectual framework for the European engagement with questions of consciousness, the nature of reality, and the soul's relationship to the divine intelligence. Figures including Giordano Bruno, who is born in 1548 and who will eventually be burned at the stake in Rome in 1600 for teachings that draw directly on the Hermetic tradition, Paracelsus, who is born in 1493 and whose revolutionary medical philosophy is grounded in Hermetic principles, and John Dee, the Elizabethan mathematician, astrologer, and occult philosopher who is born in 1527, all draw directly on the Hermetic transmission recovered by Ficino and the Florentine Circle. The Hermetic Renaissance is not a contained local phenomenon. It spreads across Europe through the networks of humanist scholarship, alchemical practice, and initiated philosophy, reaching England, Germany, France, and the Netherlands within decades of Ficino's initial translation. The alchemical tradition, which flourishes in the 16th and 17th centuries and which produces figures including Paracelsus, Heinrich Cornelius Agrippa, who publishes his 3 books of occult philosophy in 1531, and Robert Flood, who publishes his Utriusque Cosmi Historia between 1617 and 1621, is one of the primary vehicles through which the Hermetic liberation technology circulates in the post-Ficino period. Alchemy, in its Hermetic reading, is not primarily a project of physical chemistry. It is the Hermetic science of consciousness applied to the transformation of the soul, using the language of material transformation as an encrypted code for the interior work of dissolving the archonic seals and ascending through the 7 spheres. The Rosicrucian manifestos of the early 17th century, the Fama Fraternitatis, published in 1614, and the Confessio Fraternitatis, published in 1615, represent another vehicle for the Hermetic transmission in the post-Ficino period. These texts, which claim to announce the existence of a secret brotherhood of initiated philosophers dedicated to the renewal of human knowledge and the liberation of the soul from archonic control, draw directly on the Hermetic framework and create a significant cultural movement across Protestant Europe. The Hermetic Renaissance, from Ficino's 1463 translation through the Rosicrucian moment of the early 17th century, represents the most significant recovery of the Hermetic transmission since the destruction of the Alexandrian mystery schools. The philosopher and statesman Francis Bacon, born in 1561, whose New Atlantis, published posthumously in 1627, describes a utopian society organized around the principles of natural philosophy and initiated knowledge, draws on the Hermetic framework in ways that his public scientific persona carefully obscures. Bacon's Solomon's House, the fictional institution at the center of New Atlantis, is structured as a mystery school in all but name, with graduated levels of initiation, specialized practitioners working on specific aspects of the natural world, and a governing council of initiated philosophers who determine what knowledge is released to the public and what is held in reserve. The Hermetic architecture is present in every detail. The archonic management of the period simply could not see it clearly enough to suppress it before it was in print. The figure of Giordano Bruno deserves particular attention in this context, because his fate illustrates with terrible precision the limits of the Hermetic Renaissance's protection. Bruno, who is born in Nola near Naples in 1548, and who enters the Dominican order before abandoning it to pursue his Hermetic philosophical project across Europe, develops a cosmological system grounded in the Hermetic teaching about the infinite divine mind and the soul's relationship to it. His works, including De la Causa, Principio et Uno, published in London in 1584, and Dell'Infinito, Universo e Mondi, also published in 1584, carry the Hermetic framework of infinite consciousness and archonic limitation into the emerging natural philosophy of the late 16th century in a form that the Roman Inquisition eventually finds intolerable. Bruno is arrested in Venice in 1592, transferred to Rome, and held in the dungeons of the Castel Sant'Angelo for 8 years, while the Inquisition builds its case against him. He is burned at the stake in the Campo de' Fiori in Rome on the 17th of February 1600, refusing to recant. The specific charges on which Bruno is condemned remain partially sealed in the Vatican archives, but the surviving documentation confirms that his Hermetic cosmology, his teaching about the infinite divine mind, and his insistence on the soul's direct access to the divine intelligence, without ecclesiastical mediation, are central to the case against him. Bruno's execution is the archonic suppression's most direct response to the Hermetic Renaissance, a public demonstration that the recovery of the liberation technology will not be permitted to proceed without cost. The Venetian printer Aldus Manutius, who founds the Aldine Press in Venice in 1494 and who is responsible for producing the first printed editions of many Greek classical texts, plays a significant but underappreciated role in the distribution of the Hermetic transmission across Europe in the decades following Ficino's translation. The Aldine Press's network of correspondents and distributors extends across the Italian peninsula and into France, Germany, England, and the Low Countries, and the press's commitment to producing affordable, portable octavo editions of classical texts makes the Hermetic literature accessible to a far wider audience than the expensive folio editions of the earlier print era. The Aldine edition of Ficino's collected works, published in 1516, carries the Poemander translation to readers who would not otherwise have had access to it, extending the reach of the Hermetic Renaissance into the Protestant territories of Northern Europe, at precisely the moment when the Reformation is creating new intellectual space for traditions that the Roman Church has been suppressing. 1614, London. Isaac Casaubon, the Swiss-born classical scholar who is among the most accomplished Greek philologists in Europe, publishes his Exercitationes, a critical analysis of the annals of Cardinal Caesar Baronius, the great Catholic ecclesiastical historian. Within this work, in a section that occupies only a small portion of the overall text, but that will have consequences extending across 3 centuries of Western intellectual history, Casaubon presents his dating analysis of the Hermetic texts. His conclusion, reached through the application of his extraordinary linguistic scholarship to the Greek style and vocabulary of the Corpus Hermeticum, is that the texts cannot be ancient Egyptian documents. They are, he argues, post-Christian compositions, written no earlier than the 1st or 2nd century of the Common Era, and reflecting the philosophical language of the Hellenistic period, rather than the ancient Egyptian wisdom tradition they claim to represent. Isaac Casaubon is born in Geneva in 1559, the son of a Protestant pastor, and receives a humanist education that makes him one of the foremost Greek scholars of his generation. His scholarly career takes him from Geneva to Montpellier to Paris, where he holds a position at the Royal Library under Henri IV, and eventually to London, where he arrives in 1610 at the invitation of King James I of England, who has recruited him to serve as a scholar at the English court and to assist in the ongoing controversies of the Reformation period. Casaubon is, by 1614, a figure of immense scholarly authority, his reputation for Greek philological precision unmatched in Europe. His analysis of the Hermetic texts carries this authority behind it. The scholarly case that Casaubon makes in 1614 rests on several specific observations about the Greek of the Corpus Hermeticum. He notes that the vocabulary and grammatical constructions of the texts reflect the Koine Greek of the Hellenistic period, not the classical Greek that would be expected of texts genuinely originating in the ancient Egyptian past. He notes the presence of philosophical concepts and terminology that derive from Plato, Aristotle, and the Stoics, all of whom postdate the period to which the Hermetic tradition claims to belong. He notes what he interprets as Christian theological influence in certain passages of the texts. From these observations, he concludes that the Corpus Hermeticum is a forgery, a set of texts composed in the early centuries of the Common Era by Greek-speaking authors who have attributed their work to the ancient authority of Hermes Trismegistus in order to give it a prestige it does not genuinely possess. The Archon strategy deployed through Casaubon's analysis is precise. Discredit, don't destroy. The physical burning of the texts, the strategy deployed in 391 AD, had failed to extinguish the transmission. The texts had survived, been recovered, and had ignited the Hermetic Renaissance that threatened to make the liberation technology widely available across European culture. A different strategy is required for the 17th century. The strategy is academic mislabeling. By establishing that the Corpus Hermeticum is not what it claims to be, that it is a post-Christian composition rather than an ancient Egyptian transmission, Casaubon's analysis removes the primary basis for the authority the texts had carried in the Renaissance period. The Hermetic Renaissance had been built on the assumption that Hermes Trismegistus was a genuine ancient sage, a contemporary of Moses, or even older, whose wisdom represented a prisca theologia, an original divine revelation that had anticipated and confirmed the truths of Christian theology. If the texts are actually post-Christian compositions, this entire framework collapses. The immediate impact of Casaubon's 1614 analysis on the intellectual standing of the Hermetic tradition in Protestant Europe is significant. The scholarly community that has been engaging with the Hermetic texts as genuine ancient wisdom documents is confronted with a philological argument that it cannot easily dismiss. Casaubon's Greek scholarship is too precise, his reputation too established, for his analysis to be waved away. Within the Protestant intellectual world, where the authority of ancient texts is a central battleground in the ongoing Reformation controversies, Casaubon's demonstration that the Hermetic texts are not as ancient as claimed carries immediate and practical implications. The Protestant engagement with the Hermetic tradition, which had been significant in the 16th century through figures including Philip Melanchthon, who incorporates Hermetic themes into his educational philosophy, and Johannes Reuchlin, whose De Arte Kabbalistica of 1517 draws on the Hermetic Kabbalistic synthesis of Pico della Mirandola, begins to contract sharply after 1614. The Catholic intellectual world's response to Casaubon's analysis is more complex. The Jesuit order, which has been the primary vehicle for Catholic engagement with the Hermetic tradition in the 16th century, through figures including Athanasius Kircher, who will publish his Oedipus Aegyptiacus between 1652 and 1654, maintains a more nuanced position. Kircher, who is born in 1602 and who is the most significant Catholic intellectual engagement with Egyptian wisdom in the 17th century, accepts Casaubon's dating in principle, while arguing that the Hermetic texts nevertheless carry genuine ancient Egyptian wisdom in a Greek dress, that the post-Christian dating of the surviving texts does not preclude the ancient origin of the tradition they encode. Kircher's Oedipus Aegyptiacus, a 4-volume work that attempts to decode the hieroglyphic inscriptions of ancient Egypt through the lens of the Hermetic tradition, represents the most ambitious Catholic engagement with the Hermetic corpus in the 17th century, and it preserves significant elements of the Hermetic framework within the institutional Catholic intellectual world. Even as Casaubon's analysis is contracting the Protestant engagement, Kircher's work runs to over 2,000 pages across its 4 volumes, and draws on sources in Arabic, Coptic, Hebrew, and Greek, making it one of the most encyclopedic scholarly productions of the 17th century. The institutional resources required to produce it, the Jesuit network's access to manuscripts across Europe and the Middle East, confirm that the Catholic engagement with the Hermetic tradition was not marginal but was being conducted at the highest levels of institutional scholarship. The deeper damage done by Casaubon's 1614 analysis is not to the Catholic or Protestant institutional engagements with the Hermetic tradition, but to the broader cultural authority of the texts. The Hermetic Renaissance had operated in significant part through the prestige of the ancient, through the claim that these texts carried wisdom from a time before the divisions and controversies of the Christian era, a time when the divine revelation had been cleaner and more direct. Casaubon's demonstration that the texts are not ancient in the claimed sense strips them of this prestige in the eyes of the educated European public. The texts do not disappear after 1614, but their cultural authority contracts dramatically, and with it, the willingness of educated practitioners to engage with them as the primary vehicle of a living liberation technology. The purging of Hermetic influence from natural philosophy, the proto-scientific tradition that is in this period beginning its transformation into what will become modern science, is one of the most significant long-term consequences of Casaubon's analysis. The figures who had been central to the Hermetic natural philosophy of the late 16th century, Giordano Bruno, Francis Bacon, and Johannes Kepler, who is born in 1571, represent a tradition in which the Hermetic framework of cosmic consciousness and the soul's relationship to the divine intelligence is integrated with the emerging empirical investigation of the natural world. After Casaubon, this integration becomes increasingly difficult to maintain within the institutional framework of natural philosophy. The mechanical philosophy that comes to dominate European science in the 17th century, the framework associated with René Descartes, who is born in 1596, and Isaac Newton, who is born in 1643, explicitly excludes the Hermetic categories of consciousness, archonic influence, and soul liberation from its framework of legitimate inquiry. The irony of Newton's case is worth noting. Newton, whose work in mathematics and physics will become the foundation of the mechanical philosophy that excludes Hermetic categories, is himself a deeply committed student of the Hermetic and alchemical traditions. His private papers, which remain largely unknown until their sale at auction in 1936 and their subsequent scholarly analysis, reveal that Newton spent more time on alchemical research than on the physics for which he is publicly known. He possesses a significant collection of alchemical and Hermetic manuscripts and engages with the tradition with the same rigor he applies to his mathematical work. The scholar John Maynard Keynes, who purchases a significant portion of Newton's alchemical papers at the 1936 Sotheby's auction, describes Newton as not the first of the Age of Reason but the last of the magicians, a characterization that captures precisely the way Newton's private Hermetic engagement contradicts his public role as the founding figure of the mechanical philosophy. But Newton's private Hermetic engagement is precisely that, private. In the public intellectual world of late 17th century England, the Hermetic tradition has been sufficiently discredited by Casaubon's analysis and its aftermath that it cannot be openly integrated into the new natural philosophy without damaging the credibility of the work. 3 centuries of enforced academic silence follow Casaubon's 1614 analysis. The Corpus Hermeticum does not disappear from the scholarly record. It continues to be studied by specialists in the history of ancient philosophy and religion, but it is studied as a historical curiosity, as an example of late antique syncretism, as a document of religious history, rather than as a living liberation technology. The operational content of the texts, the seven-sphere ascent, the dissolution of the archonic seals, the activation of the soul's hidden gateways, is systematically excluded from serious scholarly consideration by the framework that Casaubon's analysis establishes. The academic mislabeling as forgery is the intellectual equivalent of the 391 AD relabeling as magic. Both strategies achieve the same archonic objective, the prevention of the soul's encounter with the operational content of the Hermetic transmission. The recovery of the Hermetic tradition from Casaubon's shadow begins in the mid-20th century, when the scholarly work of Francis Yates, whose Giordano Bruno and the Hermetic tradition is published in 1964, and Walter Scott, whose 4-volume Hermetica is published between 1924 and 1936, begins to re-establish the intellectual seriousness of the Hermetic corpus. Yates argues that the Hermetic tradition was a central, not peripheral, element of the Renaissance intellectual world, and that its marginalization after Casaubon represents a significant distortion of the historical record. Her work reopens the scholarly conversation about the Hermetic texts in a way that the 3 centuries of academic silence following Casaubon had foreclosed. The Nag Hammadi Library, discovered in Upper Egypt in December 1945, provides additional momentum for this recovery, unearthing a collection of Gnostic and Hermetic texts that had been buried in a sealed jar since approximately the 4th century AD, including a Coptic version of the Hermetic text known as the Discourse on the 8th and 9th, which describes in precise operational terms the final stages of the 7-sphere ascent. The scholarly rehabilitation that Yates initiates in 1964 is deepened by the work of Garth Fowden, whose The Egyptian Hermes, published by Cambridge University Press in 1986, traces the social and institutional history of the Hermetic communities in Alexandria with a precision that no previous scholar had achieved. Fowden's research establishes that the Hermetic texts were produced by real, initiated communities, not by isolated literary forgers, and that these communities maintained a living pedagogical tradition that the texts were designed to serve. His work directly challenges the Casaubon framework by demonstrating that the question of the text's precise date of composition is separate from the question of the tradition they encode, a tradition that Fowden traces with documented historical evidence back through the Ptolemaic period and into the Egyptian temple culture that precedes it. The Casaubon framework treats dating as determinative of authenticity. Fowden's research demonstrates that the transmission is older than the surviving written form of its texts, a conclusion that the Hermetic tradition itself has always maintained. The Dutch scholar Roelof van den Broek, whose Gnostic Religion in Antiquity is published by Cambridge University Press in 2013, extends Fowden's institutional analysis by tracing the specific social networks through which the Hermetic texts circulated in Alexandria and the broader Mediterranean world. Van den Broek identifies what he calls the Hermetic Lodge, a specific type of initiated community that functioned as the primary vehicle for the transmission of the corpus in the first 3 centuries of the Common Era, distinct from both the philosophical schools of the Neoplatonic tradition and the congregational communities of the Gnostic movement. The Hermetic Lodge, as Van den Broek reconstructs it from the internal evidence of the texts and the external evidence of the papyrological and epigraphic record, is a small group of initiated practitioners, typically between 5 and 15 members, who meet regularly for the practice of the Hermetic sequence, the reading and working of the texts in their proper order, and the transmission of the living frequency between teacher and student. Van den Broek's reconstruction confirms that the Corpus Hermeticum was not a literary production designed for individual private reading, but a communal practice document designed for use in exactly the kind of initiated group setting that the Egyptian mystery schools had been providing for, 3,000 years before the Greek texts were written down. The liberation technology encoded in the Corpus Hermeticum is not, as centuries of archonic management have attempted to establish, a set of metaphors for interior psychological states, or a philosophical framework for thinking about consciousness in the abstract. The 7-sphere ascent, described across the Hermetic corpus, and mapped with the greatest precision in the Poimandres and the 13th treatise, is a working protocol. Thoth designed it to function in the body of the practitioner who engages with it correctly, using the specific sequence, the specific frequencies, and the specific activation points that the texts describe. The technology works. It has worked for every initiated practitioner who has engaged with it properly across the centuries of its transmission. The archonic suppression has been directed precisely at preventing this engagement, because the archons cannot maintain their control over a soul that has completed the 7-sphere ascent. The soul's descent through the 7 spheres, as the Poimandres maps it, is not a mythological event that happened once in the distant past. It is an ongoing process, one that the soul undergoes in each incarnation, collecting the archonic seals fresh with each descent into the material sphere. The practitioner who engages with the Hermetic liberation technology is not working to undo a single ancient event. They are working to dissolve the specific archonic installations that are operating in their body and consciousness in the present moment. The covetousness that drives compulsive reaching for external objects, the falsehood that distorts their perception of reality, the desire that mistakes physical craving for genuine spiritual longing, the arrogance that identifies the ego as the true self, the rashness that misdirects the soul's creative fire, the greed that substitutes material accumulation for genuine expansion, and the malice that poisons the soul's relationship to its own nature. Each sphere holds one archonic implant layer, and each implant layer has a specific frequency signature that the practitioner can learn to identify in their own experience. This is the first stage of the liberation work, recognition. The soul that cannot distinguish the archonic implant from its own genuine nature cannot begin the work of dissolution. The early treatises of the corpus, the 1st through the 6th, are designed to produce this recognition, to bring the practitioner to the point of clearly seeing the 7 seals operating in their own consciousness and body, feeling the specific quality of each one, recognizing the way it distorts perception and behavior, and understanding its relationship to the specific sphere and archonic intelligence from which it originates. The moon sphere's implant of covetousness is typically the most immediately accessible to the practitioner who begins the recognition work. It operates as a constant background pressure, a sense of lack that drives the reaching for external objects, experiences, relationships, and achievements as substitutes for the soul's original fullness. The practitioner who has learned to feel this implant in their body, who can sense the specific location and quality of the covetousness pressure, who can distinguish it from their genuine desires and aspirations, has taken the first step of the ascent. The moon sphere is the first layer of the archonic prison to be encountered in the ascent, because it is the outermost layer, the one installed last during the soul's descent, and therefore the first to be reached in the reverse journey. The Mercury sphere's implant of falsehood operates more subtly than the moon implant. It works through the soul's own cognitive faculties, distorting the capacity for clear perception and honest self-assessment. The practitioner who begins to dissolve the Mercury implant experiences a progressive clarification of their inner and outer perception, a growing capacity to see what is actually present, rather than what the archonic distortion has been projecting. This clarification is often experienced as uncomfortable, because the Mercury implant has been protecting certain beliefs and self-images that the soul has been depending upon for its sense of security. The dissolution of this implant requires the courage to see clearly, which is why the seventh treatise of the Corpus, which addresses the greatest evil of ignorance, is positioned where it is in the sequence. The Venus sphere's implant of desire is one of the most powerful of the seven, because it operates through the soul's genuine capacity for love and longing, hijacking these authentic frequencies and redirecting them toward archonic feeding. The practitioner who has not yet begun the dissolution of the Venus implant experiences their genuine spiritual longing as physical craving, emotional dependency, or the compulsive pursuit of experiences that provide temporary relief from the underlying sense of separation from the divine intelligence. The dissolution of this implant does not eliminate the soul's capacity for love and longing. It restores them to their original orientation, directing them upward toward the divine mind rather than outward toward archonic substitutes. The Sun sphere's implant of arrogance sits at the center of the seven, which reflects its central role in the maintenance of the archonic prison. The arrogance implant is the one that installs the ego's identification with itself as the true self, the belief that the constructed personality, with its history, its preferences, its fears and ambitions, is the fundamental reality of what the soul is. This implant is the most resistant to dissolution, because the ego that it has constructed is the very instrument through which the dissolution work must be conducted. The practitioner must use the ego to see through the ego, which requires a precision of attention that the Hermetic texts are designed to cultivate through the progressive work of the preceding gates. The Mars sphere's implant of rashness operates through the soul's creative fire, the genuine energetic force that drives action and creation in the material world. The archonic installation at the Mars sphere redirects this force into aggression, impulsiveness, and destructive action, preventing the soul from directing its creative energy toward the ascending work of liberation. The dissolution of the Mars implant releases the soul's creative fire in its original, ascending form, and the practitioner who reaches this stage of the work often experiences a significant increase in energy, clarity, and creative capacity as the misdirected force is returned to its proper orientation. The Jupiter sphere's implant of greed operates through the soul's genuine capacity for expansion, its original drive to grow, to encompass more of reality, to extend its consciousness beyond its current boundaries. The archonic installation redirects this capacity into material accumulation, the substitution of external acquisition for genuine interior expansion. The practitioner who dissolves the Jupiter implant experiences the restoration of the soul's genuine expansive drive, now oriented toward the ascent through the spheres rather than the accumulation of material objects and experiences. And the Saturn sphere holds the deepest seal. The Saturn sphere is last in the ascent, which means it is the most deeply embedded of the archonic installations, the one that has been in place the longest, the one that has had the most time to integrate itself into the soul's fundamental sense of what it is. Saturn's implant of malice is not aggression in the Mars sense. It is a more fundamental distortion, a deep poisoning of the soul's relationship to its own nature, a quality of self-hatred or self-betrayal that operates beneath the surface of conscious experience and that undermines every genuine spiritual aspiration from within. The practitioner who reaches the Saturn sphere in the ascent work is confronting the deepest layer of the archonic prison, the one that the system of suppression has worked hardest to protect. Ch. I maps the exact sequence of dissolution with a precision that no other surviving ancient text matches. The Poimandres describes the soul's ascent through the seven spheres in explicit, operational terms, naming each sphere, naming each implant that is surrendered at that sphere, and describing the quality of consciousness that the soul recovers as each seal is dissolved. The text does not describe this process as something that happened to Hermes in a visionary experience. It describes it as the process that every soul undergoes on its return journey to the divine mind, the process that the reader is being prepared to undertake through their engagement with the corpus. The practical work of the seven-sphere ascent, as taught in the Egyptian mystery schools and preserved in the Hermetic transmission, engages the body's hidden gateways in a specific sequence that mirrors the cosmological sequence of the spheres. The pineal gland, which the Hermetic record identifies as the primary interface between the soul's ascending frequency and the material body, is activated through specific techniques of meditative attention and sound frequency that the corpus encodes in its instructions. The vagus point behind the ear, which the mystery school tradition identifies as the primary gateway for the dissolution of the Saturn seal, is engaged through specific touch and frequency practices that the 13th treatise describes in its account of the night of rebirth. The thymus, which sits at the center of the chest and which the Hermetic tradition identifies as the seat of the soul's genuine emotional intelligence, is activated through the dissolution of the Venus and Sun implants, restoring the soul's capacity for authentic feeling as distinct from archonic emotional hijacking. The Nag Hammadi text, known as the Discourse on the 8th and 9th, which was buried in the Egyptian desert around 350 AD and not recovered until 1945, provides an additional layer of operational detail for the final stages of the ascent. The text describes a direct transmission between a teacher and student, in which the student is guided through the 8th and 9th spheres, the levels of consciousness that lie beyond the 7 archonic spheres, and that represent the soul's approach to the divine mind itself. The 8th sphere, which the Hermetic tradition calls the Ogdoad, is the level at which the soul first encounters the divine intelligence in its undistorted form, free from the archonic interference that has characterized all 7 of the lower spheres. The 9th sphere, the Ennead, is the level of direct union with the divine mind, the state that the Poimandres describes as the final destination of the ascending soul. The discourse on the 8th and 9th confirms that the liberation technology of the Corpus Hermeticum is not merely theoretical. It is a working protocol that initiated practitioners in Alexandria were actively using in the 4th century AD, guiding students through the complete sequence of the ascent in real time. The Coptic text of the Discourse on the 8th and 9th, which occupies pages 52 through 63 of Codex the 6th of the Nag Hammadi Library, was first translated into English by the scholars James Brashler, Peter Dirkse, and Douglas Parrott, whose translation appears in the Nag Hammadi Library in English, edited by James Robinson and published by Harper & Row in 1977. The text's recovery and translation represents one of the most significant events in the modern history of Hermetic scholarship, providing direct confirmation that the ascent technology described in the Greek corpus was not merely a literary device, but an active practice conducted in real initiatory settings. The teacher in the discourse instructs the student to enter a state of interior silence, to speak specific invocations in that silence, and to remain receptive to the transmission that follows. The sequence is identical in structure to the sequence described in CH 13. The two texts, separated by geography and the accident of survival, confirm each other's operational content with a precision that no amount of archonic academic management has been able to fully neutralize. This is not allegory. It is a working protocol, tested by initiated practitioners across thousands of years of the Hermetic transmission, preserved through centuries of suppression, and available to the soul that approaches the corpus with the correct interior orientation and the willingness to move through the sequence as Thoth designed it. The practitioner who completes the 7-sphere ascent does not return to ordinary life unchanged. The dissolution of the 7 archonic seals produces a permanent alteration of the soul's frequency, a restoration of its original sovereign nature that the archonic system cannot easily reinstall. This is why the liberation technology was suppressed. This is why the Corpus Hermeticum was burned, buried, relabeled, and discredited across 16 centuries. The Greek Magical Papyri, a collection of texts from Greco-Roman Egypt spanning the 2nd century BC to the 5th century AD, and first published in a comprehensive scholarly edition by Karl Preissendans between 1928 and 1931, contain multiple passages that parallel the operational content of the Hermetic ascent technology, with a specificity that confirms the two traditions were drawing on the same foundational practice base. The papyri, which were acquired by European collectors and institutions across the 19th century, and which are now distributed across collections in Paris, London, Leiden, and Stockholm, include invocations of the divine mind, descriptions of the soul's journey through the planetary spheres, and specific techniques for activating the body's hidden gateways that correspond point by point with the instructions encoded in the Corpus Hermeticum. Hans-Dieter Betz, whose 1986 University of Chicago Press edition of the Greek Magical Papyri in translation remains the standard scholarly reference, notes in his introduction that the boundary between the Hermetic philosophical tradition and the practical magical tradition represented by the papyri is far less clear in the ancient sources than the modern scholarly categories of philosophy and magic would suggest. This observation confirms what the Hermetic tradition has always maintained. The liberation technology is practical, it is operational, and it works in the body of the practitioner who engages with it correctly, regardless of whether the institutional framework surrounding it labels it philosophy or magic. The 13th treatise of the Corpus Hermeticum stands apart from everything that precedes it in the collection. The first 12 treatises are cosmological, philosophical, instructional in the preparatory sense. They build the framework. They dissolve the surface layers of archonic conditioning. They prepare the soul for the encounter that the 13th treatise describes. CH13 is not preparatory. It is the transmission itself, the account of the rebirth that happens in a single night of direct instruction between Hermes Trismegistus and his son Tat. The setting of CH the 13th is intimate in a way that none of the other treatises quite matches. Tat has received the preparatory instruction. He has moved through the preceding teachings. He has done the work that the first 12 gates require. He comes to his father Hermes in a condition of readiness that the text describes precisely. He is outside the city, in a place of silence, at a time of stillness. The rebirth that Hermes is about to transmit to him requires this exterior silence as a reflection of the interior state that the preparatory work has produced. The outside world must be quiet, the body must be still. The mind must have been cleared of the archonic noise that the earlier treatises have been progressively dissolving. Only then can the transmission of the 13th treatise function at its full operational capacity. Pay attention to this next detail, because it explains everything. The rebirth that CH13 describes is not a gradual process extended across years of spiritual practice. It is a transmission that happens in one night. Hermes tells Tat explicitly, "I have nothing to teach you that can be grasped by the senses or seen by the eyes. It happens outside the body and outside time." What Hermes is describing is a direct frequency transfer, a transmission of the divine mind's living intelligence into the prepared soul of the student, one that bypasses the ordinary cognitive and sensory faculties entirely and operates through the soul's own deepest nature, the nature that has been progressively uncovered through the dissolution of the 7 archonic seals. The 12 tormentors that the 13th treatise names are the specific archonic forces that have been operating in Tat's consciousness throughout his preparatory journey, forces that are not identical to the 7 sphere-specific implants, but that represent the finer texture of archonic interference at the level of thought and emotion. The 12 tormentors are ignorance, grief, incontinence, desire, injustice, greed, deceit, envy, treachery, anger, rashness, and malice. These 12 forces have been identified, recognized, and progressively weakened through the work of the first 12 treatises. In the transmission of CH13th, they are dissolved entirely, replaced by the 10 divine powers that constitute the soul's original nature: knowledge, joy, self-control, steadfastness, justice, liberality, truth, the good, life, and light. The movement from 12 tormentors to 10 divine powers is not a psychological improvement in the ordinary sense. It is a fundamental ontological shift, a change in what the soul is, not merely how it feels or thinks. The soul that has undergone the rebirth of CH13th is not the same soul that entered the preparatory sequence. It has been restored to its original frequency, the frequency it carried before the descent through the 7 spheres installed the archonic seals. The 10 divine powers are not qualities that the soul acquires through effort or discipline. They are the soul's original nature, revealed by the removal of the archonic interference that has been obscuring them. The Saturn seal, the deepest of the archonic installations, dissolves through spoken frequency in the transmission of CH13th. This is one of the most operationally specific details in the entire corpus. The dissolution of the Saturn seal is not achieved through contemplation, through intellectual understanding, or through ritual action in the material world. It is achieved through a specific spoken frequency, a sound that carries the vibration of the divine mind directly into the Saturn layer of the archonic prison and dissolves it from within. Hermes transmits this frequency to Tat in the course of the CH13 transmission, and the text encodes the mechanism of this transmission in a form that the prepared reader can activate in their own practice. The hymn that Hermes sings to Tat at the climax of CH13th, known in the scholarly tradition as the secret hymnody, is the encoded form of this spoken frequency. The hymn addresses the divine powers of the cosmos directly, calling them by name, invoking their presence in the body of the practitioner, and commanding the dissolution of the archonic interference that has been blocking their expression. The secret hymnody is not poetry in the decorative sense. It is a frequency technology, a specific sequence of sounds and invocations that the Hermetic mystery school tradition understands to operate directly on the archonic seals when spoken in the correct interior state. The text specifies that the hymn is to be spoken in silence, meaning in the interior silence produced by the preparatory work of the preceding 12 gates, not in the absence of sound, but in the absence of archonic mental noise. The practitioner who speaks the secret hymnody in this interior silence is activating the same mechanism that Hermes activates in his transmission to Tat, using the spoken frequency as the instrument of the Saturn seal's dissolution. The scholarly translation of CH 13th, that most fully preserves the operational texture of the original Greek, is the one produced by Clement Salaman, Doreen van Ooyen, William Wharton, and Jean-Pierre Mahe, published as The Way of Hermes by Inner Traditions in 2000. This translation, which draws on Mahe's decades of work with the Coptic and Greek Hermetic manuscripts, renders the secret hymnody in a form that preserves the rhythmic and invocatory structure of the original, making it usable as a spoken practice rather than merely readable as a literary text. Mahe's scholarly apparatus, which traces the specific Greek terms of the 12 tormentors and 10 divine powers back through their usage in Platonic and Stoic philosophy, confirms that these are not arbitrary lists. Each term carries a precise philosophical weight that maps onto the specific archonic and divine frequencies the text is designed to work with. The translation is the closest available approximation of the original transmission vehicle in English. The Greek term that Hermes uses in CH 13 for the rebirth itself is palingenesia, a word that appears in the Stoic philosophical tradition to describe the periodic regeneration of the cosmos, and that Hermes repurposes to describe the individual soul's regeneration through the dissolution of the archonic seals. The Stoic background of this term is not accidental. Thoth encoded the liberation technology in the intellectual language of the Hellenistic world, using terms that carried existing philosophical weight while redirecting their meaning toward the operational content of the Hermetic transmission. A reader trained in Stoic philosophy who encounters palingenesia in CH 13th would recognize the cosmological resonance of the term, while being invited to understand it in a more intimate and personal sense. Not the regeneration of the cosmos, but the regeneration of the individual soul, happening in one night, in a place of silence, through the direct transmission of the divine mind's living frequency. The Stoic philosopher Marcus Aurelius, writing his Meditations in the 2nd century AD, uses related language about the soul's capacity for renewal that carries unmistakable Hermetic resonance, confirming that the palingenesia teaching was circulating in the broader philosophical culture of the period in forms that reached even the Roman imperial court. The practice drawn directly from CH 13th that is available to the practitioner tonight, before sleep, is precisely calibrated for the conditions that the text specifies: silence, stillness, exterior quiet that reflects interior preparation. The soul that has been moving through the Corpus Hermeticum in sequence, that has been doing the recognition and dissolution work of the preceding treatises, arrives at this practice in a condition of readiness that makes it operative at a level that would not be available to the unprepared practitioner. The sleep state that follows the CH 13 practice is not ordinary sleep. It is the sacred battleground that the Hermetic tradition has always known it to be, the period during which the soul travels, encounters archonic interference, and has the opportunity to operate from its restored frequency rather than its archonically sealed one. The specific practice of CH 13th for tonight involves 3 stages. The first stage is the dissolution invocation, the spoken frequency that addresses each of the 12 tormentors by name and commands their dissolution in the name of the divine mind. The second stage is the reception invocation, the spoken frequency that invites the 10 divine powers to fill the space that the dissolved tormentors have vacated. The third stage is the stillness, the period of interior silence that allows the transmission to complete itself in the body, activating the pineal gland, the vagus point behind the ear, and the thymus in the sequence that the Hermetic mystery school tradition has preserved across thousands of years. The Coptic parallel to this 3-stage structure appears in the discourse on the 8th and 9th, where the teacher guides the student through an almost identical sequence. First, the naming and releasing of the forces that have been blocking the ascent, then the invocation of the divine frequencies that replace them, then the extended period of receptive silence in which the transmission completes. The structural identity between CH 13 and the discourse on the 8th and 9th, 2 texts separated by geography, language, and the accident of survival, confirms that this three-stage sequence is not a literary convention. It is the actual protocol, preserved independently in two different branches of the Hermetic transmission, and confirmed by both as the operative mechanism of the night rebirth, which, looking back, was either incredibly brave or incredibly stupid. The decision of the initiated teachers of Alexandria to encode the most operationally specific of the Hermetic practices in a text that could circulate publicly, that could be copied, distributed, and eventually printed and made available to any reader with the preparation to use it. The archonic suppression that targeted the Corpus Hermeticum across 16 centuries was responding to exactly this decision. The technology was too powerful to be left in a text that anyone could access. But Thoth designed it precisely this way, knowing that the soul who was not ready to use it would not be able to activate it regardless of their access to the text, and knowing that the soul who was ready would find the text regardless of the obstacles placed in its path. The Hermetic record is explicit. The rebirth described in CH13 is available to the soul that has done the preparatory work in any era, under any historical conditions. The 16 centuries of suppression did not prevent the souls who were ready from accessing the transmission. It made the path harder, more indirect, more dependent on the fragments and traces that survived the burning and the relabeling and the academic discrediting. But the transmission itself, the living frequency that Thoth encoded in the architecture of the texts, cannot be burned or discredited. It activates in the body of the prepared soul, as reliably in the 21st century as it did in the mystery schools of Alexandria in the 3rd century of the Common Era. Tat saw it coming. He told Hermes, in the dialogue of CH13, that he was ready for the transmission, that the preparatory work had brought him to the threshold. Hermes confirmed it and began. Nobody listened to the warning that this transmission carries about the Saturn seal's particular resistance, the way it fights dissolution more fiercely than any of the other 6 implants, the way the practitioner approaching the final stage of the night rebirth practice may feel a surge of the malice quality, a sudden intensification of self-doubt or self-betrayal, precisely as the seal is about to dissolve. This is not a sign that the practice is failing. It is the seal's final activation before dissolution. The practitioner who understands this, who has been prepared by the sequence of the corpus, moves through it rather than retreating from it. 415 AD, Alexandria, a mob in the streets. Except now you hold what they burned. Subscribe so the next transmission reaches you before the suppression catches up.